Hey, Larry Mednick here. So today we're going to be doing a carb sync, synchronization of the two carbs on the Rotex 912. And I know there's several videos out there showing how to synchronize the carbs on a 912, but there is a distinct difference between balancing carbs on most all trikes and many of the fixed wing aircraft, which we pull the carburetors to open, versus a lot of the airplanes use where you pull the carburetors to close. Meaning, if the throttle cable were to be cut in flight on this trike, on a REVOLT, the engine's going to go to idle. Whereas with the actual stock Rotex setup as it comes from the factory, if you cut the cable during flight, it'll go to wide open throttle. So if you have an aircraft that goes to wide open throttle, if you lose the throttle cable, don't watch this. This doesn't apply because it is that different to synchronize the carbs. I've got a regular screwdriver. I've got a 7mm wrench, and I've got two 7/16 inch wrenches as well. And then this is my Carb Synch tool, which is nothing more than a dual pointer. So there's actually two needles there. You'll see it once we fire this up. It's a manifold pressure gauge, but you can use any Carb Synch tool that you like. I just have a preference to this because the needles are in one spot, but it doesn't matter. All you're looking for is that you have equal vacuum from one carburetor to the other. So this is unimportant to use this exact one. And then also a zip tie as well. And we're gonna want to zip tie our Carb Synch tool up so that it's held for us and we can look at it and it's not just hanging. And I'll show you what the WD-40 is for, but you're going to want a little bit of lubrication to get the crossover hose off. In most cases, that hose gets really stuck, and I'm going to show you how easy, hopefully, it comes off using just a little tiny squirt of WD-40. You're going to notice that these are custom choke and throttle arms. So this is our own custom throttle system. You've got the carb spring here, and we're going to pull that off right now. And you should be able to do this by hand, usually. It's a little tough, I got it off. This is our crossover tube right here, and we're going to be hooking up to the crossover tube and to this intake manifold here to get our vacuum pressure. Okay, so getting this clamp off, this is probably the hardest part of doing a carb sync. This little clamp, on a REVOLT, the muffler's in the way, so you have to kind of get in here, don't have a straight shot to it, and get it loose. Once it's loose, you should be able to rotate it a little bit. Got to get it even a little bit looser so you can access that, but it's just a little tough. What I'm going to actually do now is I'm going to take this screw all the way out, and getting it back on is even harder, but this is the most difficult hose clamp I think known to man. So here we go. I've taken this out, and now I'm going to loosen this up, break it loose. There it is. And now I'm going to slide this down. Now with that said, I'm going to take this loose screw and I'm going to put it in the front seat. A tray off to the side might even be a much better idea. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to put anything in the back seat of a trike or any aircraft. Put it where the pilot sits. That's a good foolproof way to do it if you're going to do it that way. The other thing I want you to note is that I have the aircraft chalked up against this steel fence post. So you can tie the aircraft back, you can run it up to something, but you really want to make sure you don't have a runaway aircraft, especially when you're outside of the aircraft and all of a sudden somebody's hit a throttle on and you go to start it up and this thing takes off and you're in the way of this propeller path. So we're going to see if I can get this off dry, and this is why I brought the WD-40 over. So I'm pushing, it's really tight. It's really tight. Lift this up just a hair and give it a little squirt, just like that. And you wouldn't think that that's gonna make all the difference in the world for getting this hose on and off. But if it's been on there for a while, especially, and by the way, I let this engine cool down so I can touch the exhaust system. The last thing you wanna do is be working around a hot exhaust. Most exhausts are not on top of the engine, but nonetheless, and look at that, right off. And I can't tell you how important it is, that little shot of WD-40 or whatever lubricant that you want to be able to get this crossover tube off. So now it's time that I can hook up my gauge. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to string my gauge up. I'm going to use my parachute bracket, I think. It doesn't really matter where you put it. But you don't want this thing unsecured. You really want to somehow kind of tie it up. No science here. Right. So I'm going to take one of these. I'm going to go to the crossover tube. That's just going to insert. And again, if it doesn't go, a little lubrication goes a long way. and then this second one is going to go back to where this one hooked up to our crossover tube hookup, which is here. And make sure we get this this clamp off of here. We don't want this rattling coming off and going through our propeller. All right, so there. And now the question is, can I see my gauge? Put in that clamp in the front. All right, so I've got a pretty good view of the gauge. I've got both hooked up to the intake manifold and the crossover tube. And now, making sure I don't have any tools over here, I can start the engine. Before I do that, I want to explain what I'm doing, because you're going to have to keep a distance with the camera to what I'm doing. So the first thing you do on this type of setup is you're going to set your idle. And basically we're looking for both of these needles to be together. I'm going to walk over, I'm going to push down on the cable like so. That's going to activate the throttle arm. That's either going to make the needles closer together, which means that that's good, or it's going to make them further apart, which is bad. So if the needles are apart and I push down on this cable and they come together, that tells me that I want to screw this idle screw adjustment in to synchronize the idle. But the main thing is you want to start with the idle, get your idle done first. That way when you come back to idle, everything's smooth and your gauge isn't jumping around and everything else. So if you have a carburetor that's not synchronized, you know just how badly these 912s can shake. In this case, we removed the throttle arm on a previous maintenance, and then we put it all back together again thinking, hey, you know, how far can it move? And let me tell you, this idle is pretty screwed up. So we're gonna see if we can't fix that now. Turning on the master, making sure all throttles are back, starting the engine, clear prop. This is really far off. I'm going to do what I said. It's like our 7mm. I want to point something out here because I'm getting nowhere fast. You're going to want to zoom in and take a look at the gap between the idle stop, which is where this goes flat, and the idle stop screw. And I could put a playing card in between there. So we're bottomed out here, and we're not using the idle stop screw. We're actually hitting the cable here. So with that said, we have to get some slop in here. We got to relax this so that I can get to idle. So that is a very, very common thing that's going to happen is you start to adjust the throttle or the idle, which is what I recommend that you set first, and you can't. And so the problem is that we've got to get some slack into this cable right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this loose with our 2 7/16" wrenches, and we're going to move this forward towards the arm, and that's going to give us the slack in the cable system that we need. So very, very hot. We got to work around this. I'm getting my 7/16" wrench on. I'm going to try to hold this one without burning myself today, and I've got it loose. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to work this backwards and very carefully, try not to burn myself, move this in. We're going to get some slack going here. And once we've got that slack, now we have to tighten up this side of the cable.
You were turning that nut?
Yeah, so now we're tightening this down. So what I just did is I moved the entire housing closer to the throttle arm. And if you'll see, I've got slack, and now I want you to take a note. You can actually hear it hit. Now we actually are...
Sorry.
Now we're actually using the throttle stop screw for its intended purpose. Now I sat there and turned that screw out quite a few turns not getting the results I wanted as I lifted the screw away from the stop. Now it's probably worse than when we started. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna tighten this back up snug. We need them not to move, but at the same time, I'm probably gonna wanna come back in and adjust this, or maybe I'll adjust the other side. But the first thing we need to do is we need to get the idle straight. So knowing what I know and what I did, I'm gonna say, let me screw this idle back in just a little bit. And of course, it's always easier to get this on. You saw what a task it was to get to this idle screw. And I'm using my 7mm here, and a lot easier to get to with the engine off. And now we're gonna start it up and we're gonna monitor the gauge and see where we're at. Yeah. Clear prop. Now we're only idling at 1500. Look at our gauge here. Look at our gauge here. So it's getting worse when I do this. So we're so far off. I'm shutting the engine down, staying clear of the prop with a hot mag. And we are going to just start cranking this thing in a bit. And it's very easy to mess up your idle when you don't have the slop in the cable to allow this screw to do its job. So I'm gonna give that a try. I'm just guessing right now, and we're gonna start up again, and we're gonna see if we're any closer, if I went too far, but we gotta get the idle so that we can move forward. So here we go again. Clear prop. It is much closer. It still needs to come up on that side. Consider my tack. We're at 1650. So I'm going to bring the idle up just a little bit more on that side. But we're getting close. We're getting close. And then once we're very close, I'm going to probably manipulate the idle adjustment screw on the side of the gauge so I can watch the gauge exactly and get the needles exactly where I want. And then I'm gonna check the tachometer and say, okay, is this an acceptable idle? Now, when you get to that stage, you really wanna make sure that, I'm screwing this in, the engine is fully warmed up, because when the engine's cold, as you probably remember, it's not gonna idle as high as it normally does. So make sure you don't set the idle perfectly and you're 30 degrees below operating temperature, because then you're going to have another 200-300 RPM when you're actually using the aircraft. So we're going to go back, do it again. So everybody's clear of the prop. Clear prop. That's pretty close. And just like that, our idle set, you saw it was just one last little tiny tweak. The RPM is good, it's just right where we want it. And so our idle set. So now it's stage 2, which is the last stage, which is to set everything else. I like to run up to probably around 3,000 RPM, 4,000 RPM, somewhere in there. You do not want to do this at too high of an RPM where the butterflies both start to open, because they're being off is not going to create that much of a difference. But when you're just off of idle and there's a difference, you're going to get a lot more airflow and a lot less airflow. It's going to show the most. So right around 3,000 RPM, we're going to start this up, move it to about 3,000, take a look again. Now our adjustment comes from here. And so we're going to be adjusting the actual cable shell for the throttle to adjust our mid-range. And once we've got everything synced, that's it. And then It'll be running as smooth as it ever has. You hook up that crossover tube. That crossover tube is to further equalize the pressure between it, and it's going to run another level smoother than when you synced it with them separated. So here we go. Clear prop. Throttle. I'm going to watch the gauge right here. So what I just noted was that the needles are not horribly far off now. I gave it a little bit more throttle on this carburetor. The needles got further apart. And what that means is that we need to increase cable tension on the other side, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. And that side's already loose. I can actually probably leave this. First thing we have to do is break loose the jam nut.
Remembering everything's hot.
Everything's definitely hot. And now we've got to get a couple of threads here. And now we're going to tighten that up right behind it here. And what that's doing is it's pulling this housing out, away. Okay, and you want to make sure it's snug, otherwise it could be good and it's just going to move on you. All right, so here we go again. Everybody's clear. That was one heck of a guess. Now, the tricky part is I need to tighten that down and then do one last check and see if it moved one way or the other. But that was spot on. And there was no editing there. We didn't take out a scene. That was it. But it was just a guess. You can do this while it's running, but between a propeller that can take limbs off of you and a hot exhaust that your handles stick to, it is like touching a hot pan, these headers. Really best to work with the engine off if you can. Tighten that down. Again, we're not going crazy. I think these are brass, so it is a softer metal. It's not as soft, I don't think, as aluminum, but again, you know, you see the size wrench I'm using, so we're not way out here cranking wrenches. Be very careful about the tension that you're using. This would be a pretty good long wrench for this application. This is more the correct size wrench I like to use. It gives me control of my torque. All right, one last check. We're going to see if this thing runs with the needles together everywhere, and we'll even go to a full throttle run up now, and just to see.
And also, just a side note, just make sure that anything that's behind you isn't going to be affected by the amount of wind that is going towards it.
Yeah, the prop blast. So
yep.
Make sure you're clear. Make sure that the aircraft can't go anywhere. I cannot stress enough how many aircraft have been lost to people doing exactly this type of maintenance without the aircraft secure, and it takes off and into the trailer, into the hangar, doing lots of damage and hopefully not injury, but really, really important that the aircraft can't go anywhere.
And don't blow any trikes away from behind it either.
Yep, clear prop. All right, so that's our idle. Good. Yeah, it looked like it was coming off the ground there. So
sure did.
Make sure that you're in control of your throttles, and things start to go wrong, make sure you can get that thing back to an idle in a hurry. I think that was just our suspension unloading as opposed to the whole aircraft going. but certainly got me to come back off the throttle before we found out what that meant. Thanks for joining us. That is how you sync a carb on a Revo or a REVOLT or any of our trikes that use the 912 UL.